Welcome back to our continuing coverage of the war on Iran and its implications across the Middle East and the world. I'm Andrea Sanke, host of the Newsmakers, joining TRT World's rolling coverage, and I'm also joined today by a very special live panel. We'll be talking to our geopolitical analysts inside Iran, the U.S. and the U.K. We'll be addressing the implications of the joint Israeli-U.S. decision to attack, as well as asking the bigger question, who wins in a war with Iran? And are we looking at the early stages of an all-engulfing global conflict? Which axes might emerge and who will prove the real allies of Iran, the U.S. and Israel? So let me introduce my first guest, who joins us from inside Iran. Setareh Sadeqi is an assistant professor at the University of Tehran. She joins us now live from the city of Isfahan. Setareh, thank you so much for being with me. I want to first, of course, establish your reaction just to the past 48 hours and the events that you've seen. How do you assess, above all, actually, Iran's response to what Israel and the U.S. have done here?
Well, Iran had warned the U.S. and Israel and the entire world that in case there is a war, a massive strike on Iran, Iran is not going to refrain from engaging in a massive response, which would be at least proportionate to the attack that it has received. And this is exactly what we're seeing. They had warned that in case the Iranian leaders, including the supreme leader of Iran, is assassinated, Iran's response will create a war, and that will engage the entire region. And this is exactly what we're seeing. Iran had warned that this would have happened, and we're seeing what Iran had warned and what U.S. And Israel could have prevented but did not want to prevent. Because as we all know, and the world now knows, we're dealing with a pedophile, cannibal regime of Epstein that is ruling the United States and its Zionist regime. And they all have been engaging in either raping or killing children, attacking hospitals, schools, in the name of liberating people. We have seen, as your previous analyst also mentioned, that Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan were never liberated by U.S. occupation and invasion of the countries. It was only destruction, massacre, and decades of instability that followed the invasion by foreign powers, by the imperialist power.
Okay.
So Iran is using all its force in order to prevent the fate of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya from happening. And because Iran has a very strong military, despite all the challenges, they have managed at this point to hold the country together, even though the commander-in-chief has been martyred.
Yeah.
And I think to this point we're seeing...
Sorry, Setareh, just quickly, as you're saying, Iran is using all of its force. There are many asking who can come also to its defense, even if behind the scenes, so to speak. Or is Iran alone in this fight, but can still manage, as you seem to feel, on its own here because of its own defenses?
Well, so far, Iran has been fighting on its own. Yes, we do have allies like China and Russia that have, in the past, offered limited support that has, of course, helped Iran to carry out what it's carrying out now. But what Iran has won, and it's very obvious throughout the world, is the public opinion. Iran is not fighting a war only to defend Iran. Iran is fighting a war against as I said, a regime of pedophiles and war criminals. So the two regimes that are attacking Iran right now, one is led by a pedophile whose crimes have been exposed in the Epstein files, and the other one has a genocide case going on in the International Criminal Court going.
Okay.
And this is the war that Iran is fighting on behalf of all the free and freedom-seeking people of the world.
We've heard the theory that you've reiterated coming from different camps, but whether or not that motivation is even there, the situation is where it's at. And now President Trump is saying that Iranians Iranians, you have to take back your country. So what's he talking about there? What would you like to see fill whatever void might be created?
Definitely not. Iranians, a great proportion of the population, loved Imam Khamenei, the leader. You can see the massive turnout on the streets in different cities, mourning, but also asking for revenge to be taken for their assassinated leader. And although we're grieving and we're sad that we have lost a great leader, but we are also filled with inspiration and motivation to stand and continue defending our country. We do not want, we do not need any foreign power to help us. We have our country. The country is still in our hands, in the hands of the free people of Iran. And I know that there are a cringe minority outside Iran, especially in the diaspora. And I'm sure a lot of people around the world have now seen how cringe and sick and twisted some Iranian diaspora outside Iran can be, calling for the bombardment of their own country, where schoolgirls are being massacred, where hospitals are being targeted, and babies in incubators have to be carried out and immediately transferred in order to save lives. They have never lived here. They did not suffer from the sanctions that the U.S. regime imposed on us. They did not suffer from the terrorist attacks and to the terrorist activities that the U.S. and Israel conspired against us. They're definitely not going to suffer from the carpet bombings of Tehran or the missile attacks that are targeting many different cities in Iran. So far, more than 555 innocent people have been killed over just 2 days by U.S. and Israel airstrikes. And people are now more determined than ever before, no matter what political spectrum where in the political spectrum they stand in, to defend their countries and take it back from the aggressors that want to occupy their country. So we're standing.
Having said that, Setareh, I mean, do you believe we're actually looking at the early stages of kind of an all-engulfing global conflict here? And if so, do you see the same sort of axes forming as we saw, for example, during the Cold War? Or are you, again, feeling Iran is in its own field?
Well, if you're talking about for example, the Arab regimes in the country, they have all been compromised. And I think if you want to see where people stand, if there's anyone, any country, any regime that wants to join the U.S. in saving Israel, just search their leader's name in Epstein files, and you know where they stand, even with the Arab states, like the heads of the Arab regimes in the region. But if you're talking about a people, you can already see how people in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in Pakistan, even inside America and the UK have risen up and are calling to support Iran. In Iraq, people have been trying to take over the U.S. embassy. In Karachi, Pakistan, people have tried to take over the U.S. consulate. So inside the region, in many different countries and parts, the people are fed up with the imperialist ambitions that have been pillaging and plundering their resources and have been taking their independence away from them. So they are on board but in terms of the military support that will come, so far we have Yemen and Hezbollah and the Iraqi Popular Forces that have announced that they will support Iran in its fight against the imperialist aggression.
Setareh Sadeqi, we will have to leave it there, and I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your perspective on TRT World. And we can now welcome two new panelists from both the United States and the UK. First, global affairs journalist Tara Kangarlou is joining us live from London. CEO of Gulf State Analytics, Giorgio Cafiero, is live from the U.S. state of Hawaii. Thank you both so much for being with me. Tara, I'll start with you. Hopefully you were able to hear that exchange with Setareh there. And I'm wondering what you think as a member of the Iranian diaspora, not necessarily a supporter of the regime in Tehran. I mean, describe your feelings toward this developing conflict now.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrea. I will share my thoughts as a reporter. I've been covering Iran for 15 years and the region at large, as have you. And, having also lived in the country, I know the nuances and the isms in that society of 90 million. And I think right now, our viewers very well understand that multiple things can be true at the same time. Israel and the United States together started the war on Iran, all the while nuclear talks were going on. And in some shape or form, diplomacy was moving forward. And I think the Omani foreign minister said that very clear, that progress has been made. And I think no one can argue that, right? Now, in parallel, equally, I think it's important to understand that the public dissent and resentment in Iran toward the regime is unprecedented. I've been in touch with people in the country from all walks of life, the majority of whom are in some ways happy and jubilant as to the potential for just a glimmer of hope that may come, right? Beyond this regime and beyond the Islamic regime. Now, again, having covered the region and having seen the track record of wars and conflict, I think safely people can say that airstrikes and tanks and bombs have never brought in peace, stability, and democracy. But then you have to ask yourself to what extreme the population of Iran has been pushed to look outward, and they're all on their toes. The entire country has been pounded. Again, I'm just getting lines from people who have been telling me that explosions are heard left, right, and center where they live, whether it be in Tehran or other cities, and they're all on their toes. All the while, Andrea, I will add that this nation of 90 million, again, is not a monolithic society. You have strong pro-regime supporters like your other guest from Tehran. These are people who are ideologically charged or in some ways financially tied to this extremely powerful apparatus. But that, I can say with confidence, is perhaps 18 to 20% of this 90 million population. And the rest want to move forward. They want to belong to the international community. And all the while, they are suffering from perhaps the worst economic conditions in Iran.
Right. Interesting phrasing you used, Tara, that multiple things can actually be true at once. And when you talk about the potential for change, and we look at now the developing, I'll say, track record of U.S. President Trump, the fact that he displaced, or however we'd like to phrase it, the president of Venezuela, and then put in place a member of the same regime Tara, yes. Would you worry about that if that scenario develops for Iran? What's the point of all this?
That's an excellent point, Andrea. And as you know, and I think Georgia knows as well, yesterday, President Trump was in some ways making the rounds, getting on telephone calls with reporters. And one thing stood out to me is the New York Times was told that by the president that a scenario like what we had in Venezuela can actually work. But then on the other hand, he's encouraging the people of Iran to come on the street and take power in their hands. And so many are wondering what that looks like. And I know we're going to talk about the opposition in the program as we move on. But one thing is certain, and when you talk to people inside Iran, again, those who want to move beyond the regime, they tell you that if this system and this regime stays in power, regardless of who comes and replaces the supreme leader and comes to power as a whole, perhaps as we've seen before and patterns have shown us, the regime will be certainly more brutal and repressive, because that certainly has been something that we've seen before. And many people in Iran are extremely cautious and worried about that if this Venezuela scenario is one that President Trump is pursuing, they are left in an even worse condition as they were.
Right. Okay. Giorgio, let me come to you, because you heard the exchange with our guest out of Isfahan. And I really have to ask if Americans, particularly Trump's MAGA supporters are actually backing this action. Popular support for this matters, especially in the lead up to the election, because now we're looking at oil prices potentially tripling, and to also look at the argument, as our previous guest made multiple times, to have this kind of mistake made whereby an ally shoots down 3 U.S. fighter jets and then also uses this to distract from scenarios in the U.S. developing, including the Epstein files. She used phrasing that a lot of theorists are using right now about accusations of pedophilia and whatnot. Where does this all leave the U.S. public?
Yeah, thank you. Really good to be with you. I think it's really clear that in the United States, there is a tremendous amount of war fatigue that is a consequence of the experiences that the U.S. had in Iraq and Afghanistan after the so-called war on terror began during George W. Bush's first term. We saw from polling that only a minority of Republican voters were in favor of U.S. strikes on Iran, and an even smaller minority of Democratic voters were in favor of such operations. It's definitely the case that within Trump's MAGA movement, his base, there was a lot of enthusiasm for his pledge on the campaign trail to avoid the endless wars and to try to avoid getting the United States bogged down in these very messy, very protracted conflicts in the Middle East. And I certainly know that within his base, there is a lot of disappointment right now that Trump decided to essentially sabotage the diplomacy, or at least the talks that were going on under Omani auspices, and to join Israel in waging what many Americans view as a completely unnecessary and reckless war on Iran. Now, I think what will matter politically is how long this conflict goes on. If this is going to drag on for many weeks, many months, average Americans are going to have to pay a huge price when we're talking about energy costs, a return of inflation, and so on and so forth. And I think that there will be consequences for the Trump-aligned or even Democrats who were supportive of this aggression against Iran. And we'll have to see how this plays out with the midterm elections later on this year.
Right. I mean, for those who remember, we can't help but compare this action, of course, as you said, to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 that led to that severe war fatigue. I mean, could it unfold in a similar way, even in the details we're seeing now, with President Trump saying, he phrased it, oh, we're ahead of schedule initially. Now he's saying 4 weeks. And it reminded so many people of George W. Bush actually saying very early on, mission accomplished, only to be drawn into a multi-year conflict that many argued was actually detrimental, not just to the security of the United States, but the region and the world.
Well, one thing we know is that once a war begins, there's really never any single actor that has control over how events play out. I think Donald Trump would very much like to wrap up this conflict very quickly. I think he is of the mind that this action against Iran will make the country much weaker and force the leadership in Tehran to come to the negotiating table and meet all of the White House's maximalist demands. But the fact of the matter is Iran might not want to negotiate with the United States right now, and maybe we can talk about this later, but I think the Iranian leadership has its own incentives to carry on with this conflict, and I think they believe that time is on their side. So it was easy for Trump and Netanyahu to begin this war, but they're not going to necessarily decide when it ends.
They have said as much. They are not interested in negotiation. Let me ask Tara then. Are we looking, same question I actually introduced this segment with, how much you think this can embroil global dynamics here, whereby not just Middle Eastern partners are drawn into the conflict itself, but the global dynamics of taking us into something similar to what we saw 40 years ago in the Cold War, and even the axes developing in the lead up to the World War II.
Indeed. I think one thing, Andrea, we can say clearly is that the region is ablaze, and this conflict is widening. Everything is at stake, and I'm in London right now, and I'm looking very closely at what Europe, including the UK, is going to do. Now, I was speaking with a source in Saudi Arabia, and he's in the foreign ministry, and he was telling me that anything is possible, and there's a huge miscalculation. And we are hearing right now, we're getting lines that potentially the GCC minus Oman might be putting together a coalition to strike back, and that will be extremely dangerous. And this source of mine told me that maybe perhaps that's something that was part of the plan all along. So the stakes are extremely high. And again, if we speak with people, real ordinary civilians on the ground whose lives are directly affected by these conflicts over the past many years, they'll tell you that they don't want any of this. And I think that's extremely important to point out. The Iranian people never wanted to engage in any war and conflict. And in the words of one person that I spoke with during the 12-day war, they believe that they're caught between the lunacy of a theocracy and also the aggression of foreign countries. And as we both know, countries don't have friends, they have interests. And I think that's also another truth and reality that we should keep in mind as we look at this full-fledged war and how it's going to pan out.
Yeah. You know, Giorgio, there have been, as many have pointed out, a number of kind of contradictions in what President Trump has said and what he says are the interests of what the U.S. is doing here. And a huge part of the justification for this attack was the threat of nuclear weapons being used against the United States and their ally Israel that Netanyahu and Trump had insisted were being built in Iran. However, just a month or so ago, President Trump had very proudly said that all nuclear facilities in Iran had been absolutely obliterated in the first attack on Iran that he did not seek congressional support for.
Well, Trump is really all over the map. And when we listen to his statements and we pay attention to his rhetoric, there's so much incoherence, so much inconsistency. The justifications for bombing Iran have constantly been shifting since late last year and throughout this year. There's been talk about this being necessary to come to the defense of the Iranian protesters beginning in December. And then there's also been talk about taking out Iran's ballistic missiles, an alleged Iranian plan to attack U.S. targets in the Middle East, then, of course, the nuclear issue. But you're absolutely right. There's a big contradiction between Trump, on one hand, bragging about having essentially obliterated, I think that was his exact words, obliterated the Iranian nuclear program with Operation Midnight Hammer last year, and then his talk about a nuclear threat that Iran poses. I think ultimately Trump is trying to force Iran to capitulate on many different fronts from a position of weakness, and the alleged nuclear threat is sort of a justification, or what the Trump administration would like to have everyone believe is a justification for this aggression against Iran.
Okay. Tara, one final question for you. Many have said that this specific regime, the Iranian regime, was built to survive no matter what, and that there is no organized opposition from within Iran that's ready to take its place. So what does come next, and where would the military in Iran stand?
That's an excellent question. First of all, I think history has shown us that even the greatest and most powerful dictators and leaders and regimes can certainly fall. And Iran is up against one of the world's greatest military mights, perhaps the greatest. So at some point, regardless of who comes to its support, it will fall. Now, the regime is built in an extremely complex way. You have Iran's military that is essentially tasked with conventional warfare and really guaranteeing the safety and security